In this video, why Mexico is safer than Colombia. I recently put out a tweet to this effect, and this video is basically a follow-up to this tweet where I'm going to go into more detail as to why I believe and I know that Mexico is safer than Colombia for the average tourist, the average expat, retiree, the average foreigner, basically. For locals, maybe it's a slightly different story, but I think a lot of the same truth still holds. So there's a lot of metrics, or there's a lot of ways you could think about safety. You know, in Canada, you're very likely to get punched by a homeless guy. In Colombia, you're very likely to get your phone stolen by some guy on a motorcycle. And in Mexico, neither of these things happen. So in Mexico, the only thing that really happens is the worst case scenario. You know what I mean? Like some insane extortion, or by the time you know you're in trouble in Mexico, your life is over. Maybe I'll cut that. No. What I'm basically saying is, I noticed that in my travels in other places like Brazil, Paraguay, Argentina, and Colombia, kind of anywhere in South America, phone thefts are very common. You know, you have your phone out in the street, someone comes by and snatches it, either on a motorcycle or a bicycle or something like that, right? And you kind of won't be able to get away from that in a lot of South American countries or Latin American countries. But I've noticed that Mexico doesn't really have that culture of stealing your phone. And by extension, it really doesn't have that culture of petty theft. I know a lot of Mexicans would probably disagree with that. There still is, I guess, a decent amount of burglary, you know, where they burglarize your home or maybe your car or something. But in-person theft, or like an in-person confrontational robbery, really is not common in Mexico. And I think at least part of this is because Mexico has the most organized criminal organizations of any country in Latin America, right? You have the cartels, you have the Sinaloa cartel, the Jalisco cartel. And I think because the crime is so organized that the criminal organizations, the cartels, they won't tolerate other people committing crime outside their organizations. And the organizations themselves, they don't have any kind of organized racket of small-time robbery. It's just not something that they do. It's not worth the heat, probably. But in any case, at organizational level, these cartels don't really engage in small-time robbery, right? They're really focused on, you know, exporting and doing the other crazy stuff that they do. So the cartels don't participate in small-time robbery, but they also regulate crime in a given region or a given city or a given plaza, as they call it. And because of that, they won't tolerate other small-time criminals doing that type of stuff in their cities. And so for that reason, it's kind of like, maybe you've heard about this with the Italian mafia in New York back in the 70s and 80s or something like that, where the Italian mafia-run neighborhoods in New York actually used to be incredibly safe for the average pedestrian, because the Italian mafia kind of regulated the neighborhoods and made sure that everything was kosher and made sure that, you know, their people were being protected. And I think there's elements of that in Mexico. I think they're not quite, I don't think they don't do quite as good a job as the Italian mob used to do back in New York. But I think there's elements of that idea where the cartel sort of controls illegal activity in a given area, and for that, there's not really a lot of robbery. So Colombia is a weird one, right? I think the small towns can be very safe. I think cities under a certain size, like cities under, say, 300,000 people, can be quite safe in Colombia. But every big city in Colombia is incredibly crime infested. You think Bogota, lots of crime. Medellin, unbelievable amount of crime. Cartagena, tons of crime. And you can only imagine, you go down the list, Cali, probably tons of crime. Barranquilla, tons of crime. So the big 5 or 6 cities in Colombia are all very subject to lots of random acts of small crime and really just lots of crime in general. And this is something that as a tourist, you can't really escape, or as an expat, you can't escape. Whereas in Mexico, Mexico has basically put out a policy where you don't touch a tourist. And Colombia really has no such policy. Colombians have no problems about, getting over on a tourist, whether it be through a street crime or through, Scopolamine and robbing someone, which is a whole nother story. But long story short, in Mexico, criminals are specifically told not to touch foreigners, whereas in Colombia, foreigners are specifically targeted. So you have in Mexico, which the reputation is of it being maybe the highest crime country in Latin America because it has a higher murder rate, but the murders are all, beefs between cartels and stuff like that. But there's really a policy where they don't touch foreigners. Whereas in Colombia, it seems like the policy is let's definitely touch foreigners because it's the easiest money we'll ever get. And it's obviously ruining their reputation right now. And there's more and more bad news coming out about Colombia every day. But in Mexico, you really never hear bad news. And there's a statistic. If I wasn't so lazy, I'd include it in the video itself. It might be hard to find. But I remember seeing a statistic that said there were X millions of tourists to Mexico in 2022 or 2023. Millions of tourists, like tens of millions. Tens of millions. And there were like 2 or 3 Americans died, something like that, out of millions of tourists. And when you consider how hard an American goes when they're in Mexico, right? Like they're drinking hard, they're staying out late, they're doing crazy stuff, they're getting active basically every single day, probably doing things. They're probably putting themselves in more dangerous situations in Mexico than they would be when they're back home, just because they feel like they're on vacation and we gotta go hard and party and this and that. Obviously, that's only a subsegment of the tourists in Mexico, but I think it's a lot. I think like a good amount of those millions of American tourists, had a drink when they were in Mexico. Long story short, the ratio of American deaths to visitors was like statistically unbelievably low, right? So you're statistically probably less likely to die on vacation in Mexico versus if you had just stayed home. That's how low the statistic was. So the statistics do back it up that Mexico is extremely safe for Americans. The statistics do back it up. And anecdotally, I think everyone agrees that Mexico is much safer than they expected. That's not to say that there aren't concerns or things that you should be aware of. Obviously, you still need to be street smart. But really in Mexico, your beef is more with the cops, actually, than it is with local vagabonds or something like that. It's more the cops who might try to extort you, get a couple dollars out of you for this or that thing, and they're pretty good at that in places like Playa del Carmen. It's really most common down in the Yucatan Peninsula, but it can really happen anywhere, especially if you're in a car. So you do have to be aware of cops, but obviously they're just trying to get a little money out of you. They're not trying to actually harm you. So long story short, Mexico, very safe because at a national crime level, they basically said, don't touch gringos or you're going to be in trouble. And there was actually a case, right? Maybe you saw this one last year. I think it was early 2023 in Matamoros, which is a border town, near the border with Texas. And some Americans went in to Mexico, and it was they were clearly like kind of shady Americans. I think they were trying to do a drug deal or something to like bring drugs back to the U.S. But in any case, I think I might be screwing up the story a bit, but like 3 or 4 Americans either died or got kidnapped, and it made the news, and it was basically the first time something like this had made the news in a long time in terms of Mexicans getting harmed Americans getting harmed while in Mexico. And guess what happened next? So the cartel found out who were the perpetrators. The cartel found out who were the Mexicans that perpetrated the harm against Americans, and then they handcuffed them all, their own guys. They like handcuffed them all, and they left them in a truck with the sign, and the sign basically said like, hey, we're sorry about that. We don't touch Americans. These guys were acting a fool. You can have them, bring them to justice or whatever. And so the cartel literally brought their own cartel members, handed them to the authorities as a gesture of goodwill, being like, sorry, I guess we broke the trust. These guys were idiots. Deal with them as you must. So all that to say, Mexicans are very good about not touching tourists or foreigners. Whereas on the other side, with Colombia, we're just seeing news like every day. Obviously, you can insulate yourself from a lot of the danger in Colombia simply by not doing drugs and by not using dating apps, not using Tinder. Because what's really happening in Colombia is there's the Scopolamine thing, otherwise known as devil's breath. We'll have to do a dedicated video to this concept. But basically, the women from dating apps are drugging men, right? So you go to Colombia, you open the dating app, you want to have a date with a local girl, and she'll end up drugging you. She'll end up spiking your drink with scopolamine. And when you're under the influence of this drug, they basically just rob your apartment dry. They steal everything. I heard cases where they stole even the plates, forks, and knives in the shelves. They stole everything from the apartment that wasn't bolted down. So it's pretty insane. And they've gotten pretty sophisticated too. Like they can take your phone and maybe they'll make you do the fingerprint thing so they can open up your phone and get into your online banking. We've definitely heard tons of cases of people getting their crypto stolen some way or another. So you really have to be careful about dating and doing drugs and going out in Colombia, because there's a really strong risk of getting hit by one of these scopolamine things where they spike your drink. So that's one of the main ways that Americans are dying in Colombia. Definitely, I would say the main way they're dying in Colombia. But of course, there's other dangers as well. As I mentioned, the chance of getting your phone stolen or just robbed in the street where some guy comes up to you with a knife or whatever. This type of stuff is just way more common in Colombia than it is in Mexico. But as I mentioned, there are ways to kind of reduce your exposure to this type of danger by being smart about not walking the streets alone at night. And I think avoiding big cities is the biggest thing. Like I think if you are in a big city in Colombia, whether it be Medellin or Bogota or whatever, you're really exposing yourself to just a degree of randomness and craziness that could happen at any time. Like, we've even heard cases of you're just taking an Uber and some car hops out in front, blocks your path, and just robs you while you're in the Uber. Because they kind of see, oh, there were some foreigners in that Uber, let's stop them and rob them. So how do you prevent that? You basically can't prevent that at all. So the only way to do that is to spend time in smaller towns. Everyone wants to go to Medellin. Obviously, it has a lot of touristic potential and cool stuff to do. But I highly recommend, if you want to have a safer experience, to just go to the smaller cities, smaller towns. These places have tons of awesome culture, and they're closer to nature, obviously, as well. You got sick waterfalls and hiking and all that stuff nearby. So I think, when people are dead set on going to Colombia, we're going to start recommending that they only go to this 1 or 2 or 3 safe cities, and otherwise to just really focus their energies on the small towns. So what are those safe cities? Not to give too many hidden gems away, but you're probably looking at the Coffee Triangle. So the 3-4 cities in the Coffee Triangle are Manizales, Pereira, Armenia, and the other one. So I would look at the Coffee Triangle. I would look at Bucaramanga. I would look at maybe Valledupar, things like that. So those are kind of the medium-sized cities, and then really looking at the small towns as well. So I think that's the best way to insulate yourself. So long story short, coming to the conclusion, I think Mexico is significantly safer for the foreigner, for the extranjero, both for tourists and also for the digital nomad or expat living there on a more medium to long-term basis. Mexico is definitely safer, and this kind of runs in the face of, or runs contrary to, popular opinion. Like, I think people kind of thought Mexico was the most dangerous country in Latin America, and Colombia was pretty safe, that Colombia's kind of crime wave was in the past, in the Escobar days or something like that. But no, it really seems like, for sure, Colombia is the more dangerous country, and there's a much higher likelihood of bad things happening in Colombia than Mexico. So hopefully this video shined a little bit of light on this controversial topic. And if you have any thoughts on this, please feel free to leave a comment. Also, please like and subscribe. Really helps to grow the channel. So thank you so much for watching.